The first thing I noticed was how clean it smelled. Not sterile, not chemical. Clean the way a room smells when someone has been maintaining it with quiet, serious intention for a long time. Filtered air, the faint trace of machine oil and sealed plastic. And underneath everything, something almost like cedar, which I later figured out was the dehumidifier strips lining the lower storage racks. Someone had thought about humidity. Someone had thought about everything. I was not supposed to be there. That part I want to be honest about from the beginning, because everything that followed was a direct consequence of that one fact. I was trespassing. I had been trespassing, in one way or another, for about 6 years. Not in a criminal sense, not in a malicious sense, but in the way urban explorers do. Crawl spaces beneath decommissioned factories, the sealed upper floors of buildings scheduled for demolition, drainage systems, utility corridors, places that exist between the city's official version of itself and whatever actually holds it together underneath. I had a camera, a headlamp, a field notebook, and the particular kind of patience you develop when your hobby requires waiting for the right moment to go somewhere you're not supposed to go. My name is Reina Vasquez. I was 29 years old. I had no military training, no medical training, no survival expertise of any practical kind. I had a camera and 6 years of navigating places that didn't want to be navigated. The base was not on any urban explorer forum I'd ever found. I'd stumbled across it the old-fashioned way. A property record discrepancy in a rural county assessor's archive. A parcel listed as improved, with no structure photographed from the air. A gravel access road that didn't connect to anything the county maintained. I'd spent 3 weekends just getting out to it and walking the perimeter before I found the concealed entry point. A ventilation shaft behind a collapsed equipment shed, accessible through a crawl space that smelled like rust and old rain. The shaft was wider than I expected. The ladder rungs were coated steel, not corroded, recently painted. That should have told me something. I was too focused on the descent to register it as the warning it was. I didn't hear the news until I was already inside. My phone had dropped signal somewhere around the 3rd rung, by the time I reached the base of the shaft and felt the floor under my boots. Sealed concrete, smooth, recently poured. I had no reception, no connection to anything outside. That was not unusual. I'd been in blacked-out spaces before. I wrote it in my notebook. No signal. 11:42 a.m. Shaft descent approximately 22 feet. Entry point, vent access, west side of collapsed outbuilding. I found the door at the end of the access corridor. Steel, solid core set into a reinforced frame. It had a biometric panel on the right side. Fingerprint and retinal by the look of it. And beside that, an emergency override keypad. The door was not latched. It was open by 3 inches the way a door is when someone has propped it mid-swing and walked away. I pushed it with 2 fingers and it swung inward on well-oiled hinges. I stepped through. The lights came on. Motion-activated, cool white LED strips running the full length of the ceiling. The room was large, larger than I'd imagined from the exterior footprint. Rows of industrial shelving reaching 8 feet high on both side walls, packed with sealed containers I couldn't read yet. A kitchen module against the far wall. A central table with laminated instruction cards fanned out like place settings. A door to the left marked medical. A door to the right marked systems. Straight ahead, another sealed door I assumed was sleeping quarters. I stood there in the doorway and turned in a slow circle. Then behind me, very quietly, the door clicked shut. I heard the magnetic lock engage. It made a sound like a camera shutter, small, clean, final. I turned around and pressed my palm against it. Pushed. The door did not move. I found the interior override panel. Pressed the emergency release. The panel's indicator light cycled from green to amber to red, and then a small display screen above the keypad, illuminated with 3 words I read twice before they registered. Lockdown initiated. Stand by. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I did not stay calm. I hit the override panel 4 times with the heel of my hand. I tried every combination logic suggested. Zeros, sequential numbers, the year stamped on the ventilation diagram I'd photographed during the descent. The panel cycled through amber and back to red with the patience of something that had been designed to withstand exactly this kind of uninformed desperation. I pulled out my notebook and wrote down what I'd pressed and in what order, because writing things down is the reflex I've never been able to suppress. Even in a sealed room with no signal, even with my pulse at a frequency I could feel in my jaw, I was making notes. Override attempts. 0001-234 year of construction if 2017. Panel unresponsive. Lockdown indicator active. Time 11:51 a.m. When I stopped writing and looked up, I made myself do the thing I'd learned to do in tight spaces. Inventory before interpretation. Don't tell yourself a story about what's happening. Look at what's actually in front of you. What was in front of me was the most comprehensively stocked survival space I had ever seen, and I had been in decommissioned Cold War civil defense shelters. The shelving units held labeled bins organized by category. Food stores, water filtration, medical supplies, tools, fuel canisters, communications equipment, clothing by size, hygiene supplies in vacuum-sealed blocks. The food alone was staggering. I walked the length of one shelving wall and counted without opening anything. Freeze-dried meals in sealed 5-gallon buckets, protein stores, canned goods organized by caloric density, vitamin supplements still factory-sealed. At a conservative estimate and a single-person consumption rate, I was looking at 18 to 24 months of sustenance. The kitchen module had a propane burner, a water filtration system fed by an inflow pipe from what I assumed was a cistern above grade, and a single laminated instruction card that began, "All systems are automated. Manual overrides are located in the systems room. Read the manual before operating." The systems room door was locked. Biometric panel, same configuration as the exterior entrance. Sealed tight. The medical door was also locked. The sleeping quarters door, when I tried it, opened freely. 2 bunks, made with the tight precision of someone who thought about military corners. Pillow, wool blanket, a small reading lamp on a timer. A calendar on the wall, the current month turned to face out. A shelf with 3 paperback novels and a short stack of legal pads still in their cellophane. Someone had expected to be here. I sat down on the lower bunk and made myself breathe for 60 seconds. Just that. 60 seconds of nothing but breath. Then I got up and started looking for another way out. The ventilation shaft I'd come down was accessible from inside through a ceiling-mounted panel in the access corridor. I'd seen it on my way in. I pulled the corridor door open and looked up. The panel was there, flush-mounted, held by 4 quarter-turn screws. I didn't have a flathead screwdriver. I had a field notebook, a camera, 2 protein bars in my jacket pocket, a headlamp, a multi-tool. And the multi-tool had a flathead. I got the panel open in under 2 minutes, which felt like an achievement until I looked up into the shaft and saw what was blocking it. The shaft had a security grille mounted approximately 4 feet above the ceiling panel. Welded steel mesh. The kind of heavy-gauge barrier that doesn't negotiate with a multi-tool. It had not been there on my way down. Or rather, I understood it now. It had been there, folded flat against the shaft wall on a hinged mechanism, and the same lockdown sequence that sealed the entry door had also deployed it. The same pulse that locked me in had locked the shaft. I climbed back down. I stood in the access corridor and looked at the main room. The rows of sealed supplies, the locked subsystem doors, the laminated instructions for a space I had no authorization to operate. And I understood, with the particular clarity that comes only when there are no remaining distractions, exactly where I was. I was inside someone else's survival plan, sealed in, locked out of its systems, surrounded by everything I needed to live and almost none of it accessible. Outside, though I didn't know it yet, the world I'd driven through that morning was already changing in ways that would make the locked door behind me feel, eventually, like the least of my problems. The laminated instruction cards on the central table were the first readable text I found that wasn't a label or a dial reading. There were 9 of them, arranged in a numbered sequence, and whoever had written them had done so with the assumption that the reader would arrive calm, authorized, and prepared. The language was technical and precise. Card 1 covered the orientation overview. Card 2 covered power system startup. Card 3 was water filtration initialization. Cards 4 through 7 addressed food storage access, HVAC management, communications protocols, and medical system activation, in that order. Card 8 was a brief section on waste management. Card 9 was labeled emergency egress, and I went to it immediately. In the event of emergency exit requirement before surface conditions permit, the manual egress tunnel is accessible from the systems room through the eastern wall panel. Tunnel length, 67 feet. Exit point, concealed beneath the collapsed equipment shed, eastern face. Egress requires systems room biometric authorization. I set the card down. The egress tunnel exited at the equipment shed, the same shed I'd come through. The only way to reach the tunnel was through the systems room. The only way into the systems room was biometric authorization. My fingerprints and retinal pattern were not in this system. The lockdown had sealed everything I needed to get out through the only exit available to me. I read card 2 again. The power system startup procedure required initiating a sequence through the systems room terminal. I didn't have systems room access. I read card 3. Water filtration ran automatically off the cistern inflow. That, at least, was passive and functional. I walked to the kitchen module and turned the filtration tap. Water came out, clear and cold. I drank 2 cups and wrote down that it was operational. What I was building, methodically and without particular hope, was a working inventory of what was available to me versus what was not. The accessible column was short. The sleeping quarters, the main room, the access corridor, the kitchen module with running water, the ceiling ventilation panels which the grill had neutralized, and the 9 laminated cards. The inaccessible column was everything that mattered. Both locked subsystem rooms, the egress tunnel, the food storage bins. And here I had to stop, because when I walked back to the shelving and looked more closely, I saw that the individual bins were not padlocked or physically sealed in any way I couldn't breach given sufficient motivation. They were containers with fitted lids. I could open them. The question of whether I should was something I wasn't ready to answer yet. I found the radio on a shelf I'd initially categorized as communications equipment, a compact unit, hand-held. With a charging cradle, I pressed the power button. The screen lit up. Battery at 81%, which meant it had been charged recently. I turned the dial through frequencies, listening for anything. Static, more static, and then faintly, in a band I almost passed through, a broadcast. Not music, a voice, a recorded loop by the cadence of it, repeating at intervals, emergency management frequency. The words were fragmented through the interference, but I caught enough. All residents, immediate shelter, do not approach. Authorized facilities only. I held the radio in both hands and listened to the loop run twice more before the static swallowed it. Authorized facilities. I was in one. I was locked inside one with no authorization. I set the radio on the table beside the laminated cards and sat down. Outside, based on what little I'd just heard, something was happening that made the word authorized feel newly urgent. I had driven out here through ordinary countryside that morning. I had passed 2 gas stations, a feed store, a school bus running its route. If there was an emergency significant enough to warrant a broadcast loop on the emergency management frequency, it had either started after I went underground, or I had been too absorbed in the access road navigation to notice the signs. I pulled my phone. Still no signal. I checked the time. 1:17 p.m. I had been inside for approximately 90 minutes. I wrote in my notebook, emergency broadcast on EM frequency, partial content only, shelter-in-place language, authorized facilities. Cannot confirm scope or nature. No surface access to verify. Then I wrote, underneath that, the one question I kept returning to. Who built this? And are they coming? The answer to half of that question was in the maintenance log. I found it on the third day. Not because I was thorough. I was thorough, but the log wasn't in an obvious place. It was in the sleeping quarters, inside the cover of one of the 3 paperback novels on the shelf, which I'd initially left untouched out of some residual instinct that the sleeping quarters were personal space I was intruding on more intimately than a survival room. By the third day, that instinct had worn away. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll come back to the log. The first night was the worst in a specific, contained way. Not because of the dark. I had the headlamp and the room's LED strips ran on a timer that dimmed at 2200 and returned at 0600, with the reliable indifference of a system that didn't know anything had gone wrong. The worst part of the first night was the sound. The base had been built with good acoustic insulation, which meant that what reached me from outside had to be persistent and fairly close to penetrate. I'd been lying in the lower bunk for about 40 minutes, not sleeping, running the access problem through my mind for the 4th time, when I heard it. Movement above grade. Not animal. The rhythm was wrong, too irregular, too stop-start, not mechanical. And then closer, a sound I didn't have a clean category for. A dry, repetitive vocalization that was almost human in frequency, but hollowed of everything that makes human sound intentional. I lay completely still and listened to it move across the ground above me. It passed over the eastern wall of the main room. Stopped. I counted 12 seconds of silence. Then it continued, moving north, and faded. I turned on my headlamp and wrote in the notebook, 0131, above-grade movement, non-animal, non-mechanical, vocalization consistent with emergency broadcast language, duration approximately 4 minutes before fading, single source. I did not write what I'd started suspecting. Not that night. The second day I mapped the accessible space with the precision I bring to every space I enter, not because it was useful in an immediate tactical sense, but because having a map makes me feel less like I'm drowning. I paced out the dimensions of the main room, the access corridor, the sleeping quarters. I noted every seam in the walls where a panel might be concealed, every ceiling tile, every floor drain. I found nothing new. The base had been built by someone who did not want its walls to offer surprises. I ate one of the protein bars from my jacket pocket and drank water and tried the radio again at intervals throughout the day. The emergency loop was still transmitting. By late afternoon, I was picking up a second frequency. Not a loop, a live broadcast. A man's voice that broke in and out but carried the particular quality of someone who had been talking for a long time and was running out of neutral language to describe what he was seeing. I heard containment perimeter and confirmed fatalities, and do not attempt to reach hospitals before the frequency dropped. By the third morning I had eaten both protein bars. The food storage bins were 3 feet away. That was when I opened the first one. I want to explain the arithmetic I did before I opened that first bin, because it wasn't irrational. It wasn't the logic of hunger overriding conscience. I thought about it carefully, or as carefully as a person can think about anything, when their last meal was a protein bar at noon the previous day. Someone had built this place for themselves. Maybe for themselves and a small group. The 2 bunks suggested 2 people, possibly a third if someone took the floor. The food storage, at my earlier estimate, supported 1 to 2 people for 18 to 24 months. If the owners were coming. If they were alive, mobile, and making their way here. then every meal I consumed was a subtraction from their survival margin. They'd planned for a specific population and a specific duration. I was an unplanned variable, and unplanned variables in sealed systems are how those systems fail. But there was the other half of that arithmetic. If the owners were not coming, if the emergency broadcast and the sound above my head at 1 in the morning meant what I was beginning to suspect it meant, then the food in these bins was already orphaned. Preserving it would not benefit anyone. It would just mean that when the door eventually opened, or when I eventually found a way to force the systems room, the supplies would be intact for whoever came next. That was a defensible position. Maintain the integrity of the system for a future I couldn't predict. The problem was that the future I couldn't predict was abstract, and the hunger I was managing was not. I opened the bin. Freeze-dried meals in individual foil pouches, organized alphabetically by type. I made a list of every variety before I took anything, counted the pouches. 112 in that bin alone. I took one, chicken and rice, 420 calories, 10-minute rehydration. I boiled water on the propane burner and sat at the central table and ate it slowly with the laminated instruction cards arranged in front of me like a subject I was studying. I took nothing else that day. What I did instead was work the problem of the systems room with the methodical patience that, if I am being honest, is the closest thing I have to an actual survival skill. Urban exploration is not glamorous. Most of it is slow, careful, repetitive investigation of the gap between what a building presents and what it actually contains. You learn to read infrastructure. You learn to follow the logic of how things were built, rather than how they were meant to be experienced. You learn that the way into a locked room is almost never through the lock. The systems room door had a biometric panel, but biometric panels are mounted on walls, and walls have seams. I spent 3 hours examining the wall on either side of the systems room door, with my headlamp at low angle, looking for evidence of a maintenance access panel. A service hatch, a cable conduit, anything that penetrated the wall at a point I could work with. I found a cable bundle running from the systems room panel through the wall horizontally toward the far corner of the main room, where it disappeared behind a shelving unit. I moved the shelving unit. Behind it, flush with the wall, was a panel approximately 14 inches square, held by 4 quarter-turn screws, same configuration as the ventilation shaft cover. I had my flathead out before I'd fully registered what I was looking at. The panel opened onto a cable conduit about 16 inches deep. Not passable, but running along the bottom of the conduit was a single data cable and, beside it, a power feed for the biometric panel. The panel ran off the main system power. If main power failed, or if I interrupted the feed to that specific panel, the biometric requirement might default to a fail-secure or a fail-safe posture, depending on how it had been configured. I wrote this in the notebook and marked it with a star. Fail-secure meant the door locked permanently on power loss. Fail-safe meant it unlocked. I had a 50-50 chance of having found something useful. I had no way of knowing which configuration had been chosen without either trying it or finding documentation that told me. I was still thinking through the cable problem when, above my head, the sound came back. Not one source this time. Several. Moving in loose formation, the way something moves when it's following a gradient rather than a direction. I turned off the headlamp and sat in the dimmed room and listened to them pass. I need to tell you about the system's failures before I tell you about the log, because the order in which things broke changed how I understood everything else. The first failure happened on day 4. I woke at 0600 to the LED strips coming on as scheduled, and spent the first 20 minutes of the day the way I'd spent every morning. Radio check, water check, inventory status, notebook entry. The radio check produced the emergency loop, fainter now, and the live broadcast frequency was gone. The water was running. The inventory was unchanged from the previous evening. Everything normal. Then the HVAC system cycled off. It wasn't dramatic. There was no alarm, no warning indicator on anything I could see. The ventilation hum that I'd registered as background noise since my first hour inside simply stopped, and the silence it left was the kind that makes you suddenly aware of how much air you're breathing. The room temperature was stable. The insulation was substantial enough that ambient temperature wouldn't become critical for some time. But the air exchange had stopped. The filtration had stopped. In a sealed space, those things matter on a timeline that's longer than you'd think and shorter than you'd like. I found the HVAC status indicator, a small LED panel mounted above the system's room door that I'd initially categorized as a status light and dismissed. It was showing amber. Not red, not a failure indicator I recognized as critical. Amber, which the laminated cards did not address directly, but which the card covering HVAC management described as a scheduled maintenance cycle requiring system reset from the systems panel. A scheduled maintenance cycle. The system wasn't broken. It was waiting for someone with access to reset it. I wrote it down. Then I set a time estimate in the margin. At current room volume and two-person respiratory rate, conservative, air quality degradation begins noticeably at approximately 48 to 72 hours without exchange. Solo occupancy extends this. Monitor. Day 5, the propane burner ran out. I had known the propane was a finite resource. I hadn't known the canister was already partially depleted when I arrived. The first indication was the flame dropping to blue thread and going out mid-boil. I checked the secondary canister listed on the laminated kitchen module instructions. It was on a lower shelf, and I found it and connected it. It lit immediately. Roughly 40% capacity remaining by the weight of it. I began eating meals that didn't require boiling. Day 6, the motion-activated lighting in the access corridor stopped responding. This was a smaller failure in practical terms. I had my headlamp, but it was the third failure in 3 days, and I was starting to read the pattern. These were not random malfunctions. The HVAC was on a reset cycle. The propane was depletion. The corridor lighting looked like a sensor failure, possibly a component that needed replacement, possibly a power draw issue related to the main system running in lockdown mode without the resets it had been designed to receive at regular intervals. The base was expecting maintenance it wasn't getting, and without the systems room, I couldn't perform it. I sat with that understanding for a long time. Then I went to the sleeping quarters, and because I had run out of other places to look, I picked up the paperback novel on the bottom of the stack, and the maintenance log fell out of its cover and onto the bunk. The log was a composition notebook, the standard black and white kind, filled in with a handwriting that was small and precise and slightly left-leaning. The first entry was dated 3 years earlier. The last entry was dated 11 months before the day I broke through that ventilation shaft. His name was written on the inside cover, Marcus Bellew. Below that, in the same hand, Property Maintenance Record Site B, Authorized Access, M. Bellew, C. Bellew only. C. Bellew. A wife, I assumed, or a sibling, someone he had built this for alongside himself. I read the log from the beginning. Not quickly. I had time, and I'd learned not to skim documents that might contain the one detail that changes everything. The early entries were technical, system checks, supply rotation dates, calibration notes for the biometric panels. He'd been meticulous in a way that reminded me of my own notebooks, the same instinct to document rather than trust memory. Every entry time-stamped, every discrepancy flagged, every repair noted with its date and the parts used. The systems I was watching fail in sequence were all in the log. The HVAC reset cycle was scheduled quarterly. The lighting sensors in the corridor had been replaced 8 months before the last entry and noted as having a projected lifespan of 2 to 3 years. The main biometric panel firmware had a pending update he'd been meaning to install for 6 months. And then, 14 months before the last entry, a different kind of note. Shorter. The handwriting the same, but the spacing changed. The way handwriting changes when the writer is writing at a table instead of a desk. See Bellew. Confirmed diagnosis, stage 3. Referred to oncology at regional. Updating succession protocol for Site B. I stopped reading. Read it again. The succession protocol was never completed. The next entries returned to maintenance records, but they were sparser, the intervals between them longer. A note 7 months before the last. C. Cleared for Site B familiarization. Postponed. She said she doesn't want to see it yet. 5 months before the last. C. Hospice referral accepted. Revising Site B access to single-user configuration. Will update biometric enrollment when she is stable. The last entry, 11 months before I arrived, was 1 sentence. C passed this morning. Closing Site B indefinitely. No succession. No transfer. Returning to family. He had locked this place and walked away. He had not come back. And 11 months later, whatever was happening above my head had made his abandoned bunker relevant to someone stumbling through a ventilation shaft with a camera and a multi-tool. I sat with the log in my hands and understood that no one was coming. The allocation I had been cautiously, guiltily eating around was not preserved for anyone. The food in the bins, the medical supplies behind the locked door, the egress tunnel I couldn't reach, none of it was waiting for its rightful owner. It was just waiting. I wrote in my notebook. Log final entry. M. Bellew, 11 months prior. C. Bellew. Deceased oncology. Site B locked. No succession designated. No authorized user living. The allocation is orphaned. Then I put the log down, went to the main room, and opened 3 more bins. By day 8, I had established a routine that was less about comfort and more about not losing myself to the particular psychological erosion that sealed spaces produce. I had watched it happen to other explorers, the ones who pushed into spaces that were too closed, too dark, too long without natural light or air movement, or the sound of other people. There is a version of being alone in a sealed space where you begin to rationalize at the perimeter of your own thinking, where small decisions start to feel enormous and enormous decisions start to feel small. The antidote, as far as I had found one, was structure. 600. Lights. Radio check. Water check. Notebook entry. 700. 1 meal from the open supply bin, eaten slowly at the central table. 800 to 1200. Active problem solving on the systems room access, documented in real time. 1200, second radio check, brief rest. 1300 to 1700, maintenance inventory. What was failing, what the projected timeline was, what I could do about it without systems room access. 1800. Third meal if I'd been physically active, which I defined generously. 2000. Reading from the 3 paperbacks in the sleeping quarters. 2100. Notebook summary entry. 2200. Lights dim. The radio checks were the most important part. Not because I was hearing useful information. The live broadcast frequency had been gone since day 4, but because the act of checking, of listening, of confirming that the emergency loop was still transmitting, kept me connected to the understanding that there was an outside, that beyond the sealed concrete and the failed HVAC and the dimming corridor, a world was continuing in some form. The emergency loop changed on day 9, not the content. The same fragmented language, the same shelter-in-place directive. The quality. The signal was stronger. Whatever was broadcasting, it had either moved closer to my location or had boosted its transmitter. I held the radio and listened to the loop run 4 times in a row. Then, between cycles, in the gap that marked the loop's reset point, I heard something that wasn't part of the loop. A voice. Live. not recorded. A woman's voice. One sentence, before the loop restarted. Anyone on this frequency, Site B is not responding. Repeat, Site B is not responding. I stared at the radio. Site B. Site B was written on the inside cover of Marcus Bellew's maintenance log. Property maintenance record. Site B. Someone knew this place existed. Someone was looking for it. Someone with access to the same emergency broadcast infrastructure was calling out to it and getting silence. And I was sitting here with a radio and a charged battery, unable to transmit because I could not find the transmitter. The full communications rig that the laminated card 6 described as being inside the systems room, powered from the systems room terminal. I had the handheld radio. Card 6 specified it as a short-range backup unit, operational range 4 to 6 miles. The main communications array was behind the locked door. I pressed the transmit button on the handheld and said, "This is Site B interior. I'm inside. I don't have systems room access. Can you hear me?" Static. 4 to 6 miles, the card said. Whatever frequency this woman was broadcasting on was almost certainly beyond that range. I released the transmit button and sat with the radio against my ear while the emergency loop ran its cycle twice more. The live voice did not return. But I had a name now. Not a person's name, but a designation. Site B was known. It was expected to respond. It was part of something larger than one man's private grief and one man's private preparation. And somewhere out there, at a range I couldn't reach with what I had, someone was calling out to it and waiting. The HVAC had been off for 5 days when I started noticing the air quality shift. It was subtle at first. A heaviness in the back of my throat that I initially attributed to breathing recycled air in the sleeping quarters with the door closed. I opened the door. The main room was better. Not by much, but better. The base's sealed volume was large enough that the degradation curve was slow, but slow is not stopped. And I knew it. I went back to the cable conduit behind the shelving unit and looked at the systems room panel's power feed for the 6th time. I had been reluctant to cut the power to the biometric panel because of the 50-50 gamble. Fail secure versus fail safe. And because once I cut it, I couldn't uncut it. If the panel locked permanently on power loss, I had spent my one chance on a coin flip. But the air was getting heavier. I thought about Marcus Bellew, who had built this place with his wife's eventual survival in mind, who had configured every system with the assumption that the authorized user would be present to manage it. He was not the kind of person who would build a death trap. He was the kind of person who made quarterly maintenance notes about HVAC reset cycles. If he had considered the scenario of power loss to the biometric panel, and a man this thorough had considered it, what would he have chosen? Fail secure meant the door locked on power loss. That was appropriate for a surface entrance where you didn't want intruders, but interior doors in a sealed system where the occupants might need access to critical systems under any condition, including power failure. A thoughtful builder would configure those, reasoning in my notebook. Read it back. It held. I cut the power feed. The biometric panel's screen went dark. The amber status light above the door stayed on. That was on a different circuit. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the magnetic latch on the systems room door disengaged with a mechanical click I felt more than heard, and the door drifted open 2 inches on its hinges. I stood there with the multi-tool in my hand, and the door open in front of me and let out one long breath. The systems room was smaller than the main area, a dedicated infrastructure space, not a living space. One wall was the primary terminal, a touchscreen panel and keyboard mounted at standing height, currently dark, with a power button recessed below the display. 2 server racks on the side wall, indicator lights showing amber and red in various configurations, the communications array against the far wall, antenna feed cable, transceiver and a microphone on a gooseneck stand. and along the eastern wall, exactly where laminated card 9 had promised, a panel marked Egress. I pressed the terminal power button. The screen lit up and ran a startup sequence. It asked for a username and password. I stared at the cursor blinking in the username field. I thought about Marcus Bellew and the composition notebook, and the left-leaning handwriting and the woman he had built all of this for and never gotten to use it with. I typed Cora, the first name I could imagine belonging to a C. Bellew, and in the password field I typed Bellew and then Site B and then Cora 2019, cycling through variations with a patience I didn't feel. On the 9th attempt, see a story followed by the year of the last maintenance entry. The terminal accepted the login and the screen filled with a system management dashboard. I exhaled. Then I looked at the dashboard and understood, with cold clarity, exactly how much trouble I was still in. The dashboard showed me everything the amber and red indicator lights had been trying to communicate. 5 subsystems were flagged. 2 were in active failure. 3 were in degraded operation with escalating fault codes that the system had been logging, unattended since the lockdown initiated. The HVAC reset was straightforward. It was exactly what the maintenance card had described, a quarterly cycle requiring a manual reset command. I found it in the system menu, initiated the sequence, and within 3 minutes I heard the ventilation hum return through the ceiling. The air in the main room shifted almost immediately. I stood in the doorway between the 2 rooms and breathed. The second subsystem fix was the corridor lighting, which turned out to be exactly the sensor replacement Marcus had noted as pending. Not something I could perform, but I could find the fault in the system and command it to default to constant on in the affected zone, which the system allowed as a temporary override. The corridor lights came back on. The third problem was not fixable. The main water cistern's inflow valve had seized. The system log showed it had been failing incrementally for 3 months, its fault codes climbing through the warning thresholds, and now it was registering as fully closed. The cistern itself was not empty. The dashboard showed current volume at approximately 60% capacity, but 60% of a cistern is a finite quantity, and without inflow there was no replenishment. The system could not override a mechanical seizure from the terminal. It was a physical component above grade, mounted in the utility shed, accessible only from the surface. I wrote the number in my notebook. At my current consumption rate, the cistern's remaining volume was approximately 42 days of water. 42 days. Not a crisis today. A deadline. The 4th flagged system was the communications array. The transceiver was operational. The antenna feed was intact. The power draw was green. The problem was that the primary antenna, mounted above grade, was showing a physical fault. The system couldn't confirm whether it was a mounting issue, a cable breach, or surface damage. It was transmitting, but the signal quality indicator was at 31% of rated output. 31% of rated output might be enough to reach whoever was calling out for Site B. It might not. I sat down in the systems room chair and looked at the communications array. The microphone was right there. The transceiver was powered and connected. I could key it right now. But the 5th flagged system was the one that held my hand away from the microphone. The blast door. The exterior entrance. The door that had sealed behind me. Was showing a hydraulic fault in its locking mechanism and not locked open, locked closed, but with a degrading seal pressure that the system projected would fall below minimum threshold within 8 to 12 days. Below minimum threshold, the blast door's structural integrity against external pressure was compromised. It wouldn't swing open on its own, but it wouldn't hold against sustained external force the way it was designed to. Above grade, based on 8 days of auditory evidence, there was sustained external force in regular supply. I had 8 to 12 days before the door's reliability became a genuine question. And transmitting on the communications array, announcing that Site B was operational and occupied. Would tell anyone monitoring that frequency exactly where I was, which would be useful information both for whoever was calling out for the site and for whatever had been moving above my head every night for the past week. I left the microphone alone for now. I went back to the main room and sat at the central table and worked the numbers in my notebook until the numbers ran out of new things to say. I found the egress tunnel on day 10. The eastern wall panel in the systems room opened onto a corridor narrower than the access shaft I'd come down. 4 feet wide, the ceiling just high enough for me to stand straight. It was lit by a single strip of LEDs running along the ceiling, motion activated, and the lights came on in segments ahead of me as I walked. The floor was sealed concrete. The walls were poured in place, smooth and cold to the touch. I walked 67 feet by count, the way Marcus's card had measured it, and reached a ladder set into the end wall. Above the ladder, a hatch. I put my hand on the latch and stopped. The hatch opened to the equipment shed. The equipment shed was above grade. Whatever was out there was above grade. I had been underground for 10 days. I had heard the sounds every night for 8 of those 10 days. On 2 occasions I had heard what I interpreted as more than one source. I did not know what the surface looked like now, what the density of movement was, whether daylight made any meaningful difference to what was up there. I went back to the systems room and looked at the communications array. The woman's voice had said Site B is not responding on day 9. Today was day 10. She might still be monitoring. She might have moved on. She might be broadcasting on a schedule. Morning check-ins, evening check-ins, the kind of regular cadence that organized groups use to maintain contact with outposts and supply caches. If she was on a schedule, I might be able to time a transmission to reach her before I opened the hatch. I keyed the microphone. This is Site B interior. Occupied, 1 person. Systems partially restored. Communications array at reduced output, requesting any contact on this frequency. I let go of the transmit key and waited. 40 seconds of static. I was about to try the repeat when the static broke and the same woman's voice came through, clear enough now that I could hear the texture of exhaustion in it. Site B, this is Harlow Station. Read you weak but clear. Confirm you are the solo occupant. Confirm the Bellew protocol is not in effect. I press transmit, confirmed solo. I'm not Marcus Bellew. I'm Reina Vasquez. I accessed the site through the ventilation shaft before the lockdown initiated. I've been inside for 10 days. I have a hydraulic fault on the blast door and a water supply deadline of approximately 42 days. I need to know what's on the surface before I open the egress hatch. The pause before her reply was longer. I counted 19 seconds. Reina, this is Ellen Tran. I'm coordinating for Harlow Station, 12 miles northeast. We have Site B in our monitoring network because Marcus gave us the frequency before he decommissioned the site. We did not know it was occupied. I need to ask you something before we discuss the surface. Go ahead. The food supply, the medical supply, do you know their status? Intact except for approximately 11 days of personal consumption. Medical room was locked and remains sealed. Food storage is approximately 94% of original inventory. Another pause. 14 seconds. Reina. We have 41 people at Harlow Station. We have been rationing for 3 weeks. If you can hold Site B for another 48 hours, I can get a team to you. I held the microphone and did not press the transmit key for a moment. 41 people, 3 weeks of rationing, and I'd been sitting inside 18 months of food supply eating 1 meal at a time, agonizing over each pouch like it was something I'd stolen. Hold for 48 hours, I said. Copy. What's on the surface between me and you? Ellen Tran's description of the surface was methodical and unsentimental, which I appreciated. She had a cartographer's precision. Distances, landmarks, density estimates, movement patterns she'd observed from Harlow Station's elevated position. The main concentration was moving northeast. The area around my access coordinates was lower density than it had been a week ago. Not clear. Lower. She gave me 2 things before she signed off to organize the retrieval team. A schedule for radio contact, 0700 and 1900 daily, and a piece of information about the blast door that changed my understanding of the hydraulic fault. The blast door's exterior handle was modified by Marcus about 2 years ago. He replaced the original mechanism with a weighted camlock. You can disengage it from the inside by releasing a secondary lever he installed on the right frame, about knee height. It was his contingency if the hydraulics ever failed, and he needed to manually override. You won't have to force it. I went and found the secondary lever. It was there, exactly as she described, painted the same grey as the frame so that it blended unless you were looking for it. I pressed it and felt the camlock disengage with a mechanical thunk. I did not open the door. I engaged the lever again, resetting the lock. Marcus Bellew had thought about this. He'd thought about a version of this scenario: power failure, hydraulic fault, someone needing to get out manually. And he had installed a solution and noted it nowhere in the laminated cards or the maintenance log that I had found. It was structural knowledge, the kind of thing you know because you built it and you trust your own hands more than your own documentation. He had built this place to be survived in. He had built it for Cora, who hadn't wanted to see it yet, who had died before she ever had to decide. And then he had walked away and locked it, and it had sat here, complete and meticulous and useless for 11 months. Until a woman with a headlamp and a multi-tool broke through the ventilation shaft on the worst possible morning to be above grade. I sat in the systems room for a long time with the maintenance log open to the last entry. C passed this morning, closing Site B indefinitely. No succession, no transfer, returning to family. 11 words that should have ended this place's story. They hadn't. I thought about what Ellen Tran had said. 41 people rationing for 3 weeks. Children almost certainly. A station population that size over 3 weeks of rationing included children. And I was sitting inside a resource that could extend their margin by months. And I had been treating it like something I owed a debt to. Preserving it for owners who would never come, out of a guilt that was real but pointed in the wrong direction. The debt wasn't to the inventory. The debt was to the purpose the inventory had been built for. Marcus had built this so that people he loved could survive. He hadn't been specific enough in his intentions. He hadn't meant this particular set of people, hadn't imagined Ellen Tran or Harlow Station or 41 strangers in a rationed building 12 miles northeast. But the purpose held. The purpose was exactly this. It had just arrived through a different door than he'd expected. I got up and opened the medical room with the system terminal's access I now had, and I walked inside for the first time, and I began making an inventory. The 48 hours were not easy. The first night after my contact with Ellen Tran, the sounds above grade were louder and more sustained than any previous night. Not directly above the blast door. I had that specific dread and managed to talk myself through it by checking the hydraulic seal reading every 2 hours, which stayed above minimum threshold throughout. The movement was across the northern perimeter, back and forth in a pattern that suggested it was following a scent gradient or a sound rather than approaching with intent. I sat in the systems room with the maintenance log in my lap and kept the radio close and did not sleep for 11 consecutive hours. The second day I finished the medical inventory. The supply was substantial. Trauma dressings, antibiotics, IV materials, surgical tools sealed in sterilization pouches, medications organized and labeled in a pharmacy-style cabinet that took up the entire rear wall of the room. I could not evaluate most of it beyond reading the labels. What I could do was document it and transmit the inventory to Ellen Tran at the 0700 check-in so that she could have whoever was making the run prepare to transport the most critical items first. She read the medical inventory back to confirm reception and was quiet for a moment before responding. The antibiotics alone. Raina, we lost someone last week to a wound infection. She stopped, collected herself. We have a woman here with a post-surgical presentation that we have been managing with inadequate supplies for 2 weeks. What you're describing would change her prognosis. I press transmit. The antibiotics are yours. All of it is yours. I've been eating Marcus Bellieu's food for 10 days. I was going to figure out what to do about that, whether or not you showed up. Her voice, when she responded, had something in it that I didn't have a clean word for. Not gratitude, exactly. Something more complicated. The sound a person makes when they've been carrying a weight for a long time and someone offers to take a portion of it without being asked. The retrieval team arrived at the egress tunnel exit, the equipment shed, at 09:34 on the 48th hour. There were 4 of them. 3 adults and 1 teenager who turned out to be Ellen Tran's daughter, Phelan, 14 years old, and carrying a pack nearly as large as she was. Ellen herself was the second person down the egress ladder, middle-aged, compact, with the particular quality of someone who has not slept well in weeks, but has organized themselves around that fact, rather than against it. She came through the systems room door and looked at the dashboard, and then looked at me, and the look was not what I'd been bracing for. It wasn't assessment or evaluation, or the guarded wariness I'd developed an instinct for in the past 48 hours of waiting. It was recognition. The look of someone who has been carrying a piece of information in isolation for a long time and has finally found someone else who understands what it means. You read the log, she said. It wasn't a question. I did. Then you know Marcus built this for Cora. I know. She looked around the room. The HVAC humming, the terminal active, the medical room door standing open, the shelves I'd inventoried in precise columns in the notebook I was still carrying. He called me the week after she passed, she said. He said he couldn't come back here. He said if I ever needed it, I should call for Site B on the emergency band. He didn't say anyone would answer. She paused. He probably didn't think anyone would. He thought no one would be there. He thought no one would be there. She picked up the maintenance log from the table where I'd left it and turned to the last entry and read it and set it back down. Well, I didn't say anything. Well, she said again quietly, to the room more than to me. Here we are. We moved the medical supplies in 2 loads, the food we inventoried for transport in systematic priority order. Caloric density first, then vitamin content, then perishability, with a portion designated to remain at Site B, which Ellen had decided would function as a satellite supply cache rather than a primary station. The systems room terminal could maintain the site's automated functions remotely. She'd have someone from Harlow come out for monthly maintenance checks, which meant the HVAC would get its quarterly reset. The cistern inflow valve would need to be addressed by someone with the right mechanical skill, and the blast door hydraulics would eventually need professional attention. We have a former HVAC technician, she told me while we were packing, and a plumber, and a retired Army Corps engineer who has opinions about everything structural and is usually right. Marcus had a 67-foot egress tunnel and a fail-safe biometric configuration, I said. Your engineer will approve. Phelan had been quiet through most of the packing, methodical and competent in a way that made me think she'd been helping her mother organize logistics for long enough that she'd stopped needing direction. She was the one who found the photographs. They were in the sleeping quarters, in the small drawer beneath the lower bunk that I had somehow missed in my own search. 3 photographs in a small frame, face down in the drawer. A man and a woman at a campsite, mid-laugh about something outside the frame. The same couple, slightly older, standing in front of a structure I recognized as the equipment shed above our heads before its roof had collapsed. And a 3rd photograph, just the woman sitting in the main room of the base, at the central table, her hands wrapped around a cup of something warm, looking at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile but was close enough. She had come after all. Once. Phelan handed the photographs to Ellen without a word. Ellen looked at them for a long time, then set them carefully on the central table beside the laminated instruction cards where they'd be the first thing anyone saw when they walked in. "Leave them," she said. "This is still his place." We went up through the egress tunnel in the order Ellen had established. The 3 other team members first, then Phelan, then me, then Ellen last. I came up into the equipment shed and through the gap in the collapsed wall and into daylight for the first time in 12 days. The light was enormous. Not bright. It was overcast, a flat, grey November sky. But after 12 days of LED strips and headlamp beams, the diffuse grey daylight felt like being submerged. I stood just outside the shed wall and let it happen to me. Phelan put her hand briefly on my arm, the way you touch someone who is adjusting to something that doesn't need explanation. The team lead, a man named Garrett, who had cleared the immediate perimeter before we exited, was watching the tree line to the west. "We're clear," he said. "Moving in 3. I looked back at the equipment shed, the ventilation shaft behind it, the one I'd come down 12 days ago with a camera and a headlamp and no idea what I was walking into. I thought about Marcus Bellew driving away from this place 11 months ago and returning to his family, carrying whatever you carry when you've built something for someone who is gone. I thought about the photographs on the table. The woman at the table with her cup of something warm, looking at the camera. She had come once. She had sat at that table. Whatever she'd thought of it. The clean smell, the LED strips, the laminated cards, the meticulous man who had built it for her. That moment had happened. It was real. It was in a photograph in a drawer beneath a bunk. And now it was on the table where anyone who came through that door would see it. I shouldered my pack, turned north toward Harlow Station, followed Garrett into the tree line. "I've been at Harlow Station for 6 weeks. The woman Ellen mentioned. The one with the post-surgical infection. Her name is Dr. Priya Okonkwo, which is something of a painful irony given that she is herself a physician and had been managing her own deteriorating wound without adequate supplies, while the antibiotics she needed sat sealed in a room 12 miles away. She is recovering. She is also, predictably, now the station's most effective advocate for regular Site B maintenance runs, because she knows in a way that is written into her own body what was sitting in that cabinet. The cistern valve has been repaired. The blast door hydraulics are scheduled for servicing in the spring. Ellen's retired Army Corps engineer spent an afternoon at the site and came back with 11 pages of notes and the satisfied expression of someone who has finally met an infrastructure project worth taking seriously. I think about Marcus Bellew. Not constantly. I don't have that kind of stillness anymore. But in particular moments, when I pass the medical station and see supplies being used for their intended purpose, when I eat a meal that was measured out by someone else's foresight, when I look at my own field notebook, which is on its 4th volume now, and recognize the same compulsion that filled his maintenance log, the insistence on documentation, on recording what happened, on leaving a legible account for whoever comes next. He didn't know me. He couldn't have. He built Site B for Cora and then he locked it and walked away, and it sat waiting, maintaining itself as best it could, until I broke through the ventilation shaft at exactly the wrong moment, in exactly the right circumstances. I carry something that doesn't have a name yet. Not guilt. I've worked through that logic enough times to know it doesn't hold. Something more like permanent awareness. The knowledge that the warmth in my hands right now, the calories in my body, the 42 days I had before the water deadline that I never needed to use, came from a man who built this for someone he loved. And that love outlasted both of them, and it fed 41 people. That's not mine, but I'm the one carrying it. I think that's the only shape this story could have had.